something called an animatic. An animatic is essentially the sketch version of an animation. So when you draw a picture of a character, you begin with a sketch, and then you start to refine the sketch, and then you draw the refined line work, and then you might add color and effects and all that fun stuff. An animatic is a really rough version of the moving animation, but it really is so simple that all we're conveying is timing and pacing and positioning of camera and characters and so on and so forth. So to begin with, I'll preface once again by saying, like I said in the intro to this entire series, that I'm using a program called Adobe Flash, but all of the things that I'm going to be doing in here are going to be pretty fundamental, basic things that are applicable to all animation programs. So essentially, the main thing that I'm going to be doing is drawing, which most animation programs can do, and then creating tweens, which is moving them from one place to another. So it's pretty stock standard stuff. So to begin with, what we need to do is, once our project is set up, expand our timeline a bit, just to give us some room so that we have some movement happening already, even though there's nothing in the stage. And I'm going to draw a very rough sketch. Very rough sketch. Now, when I say very rough sketch, the animatics that I create, as you can see in the example provided within this folder, are really, really sketchy. And that's okay. That's all they need to be. We're just kind of very roughly communicating the poses and the motions of the character. So for example, here, we're going to have a very happy walk of our monkey. So I'm going to draw a very rough pose to communicate that happy walk with his arms up. It will be a bit bouncy, and we'll do all the animation to this later. This is going to be a tweened walk cycle, and we're going to go through that obviously in another tutorial. I want to make sure I get my proportions right, as we experienced during the character turnaround video. We want to make sure that the height of the body is about the same height of the head from the legs to the neck. So this is basically all I need to do. Now I know it doesn't really look like the monkey. In fact, I should probably add a tail just to show that it is the monkey. But that's all we need, because we're using these as placeholders. So in Flash, to create a tween, you need to make a symbol. So I'm just going to first make a symbol, and I'll call this tween 1. And I'm just going to drag the monkey over here to the very right, off of the stage. And that is going to be where his first keyframe is. Then much later, let's tentatively say at frame 120, I'm going to pull him across all the way to the other side of the stage. Once I've created those two keyframes, I can add my tween, and you can see that we have the motion. Now, the pace is a little too brisk, so I'm going to slow that walk's pace down by dragging the second frame out to frame 170. This is all running at 24 frames per second. That is a better pace that I'm more satisfied with, so I'm going to keep that. So the next part of my animatic is going to be another action. I'm splitting this animatic up into several different stages. So it's all going to play chronologically, but in my mind, I'm breaking it up into the different sort of tutorials we're going to be doing. And the first tutorial is going to be the simplest, which is using this character doing a tweened walk cycle. Once that character has finished crossing to the other side of the screen and off the stage, we're going to have him reappear, but this time he's going to be thrown in, and he'll bounce twice, and I want to make sure that the ground area is about the same as it was before, so I'm going to just make sure that the leg position is about the same where the arc ends. The bounce gets shorter and shorter, and he's going to land there. So I'm going to leave this bounce arc here, and I'm going to use it as a bit of a reference. To do so, I'm going to add a new layer. And on this layer, I'm going to continue to animate the monkey. Now, to keep everything uniform and simple, I'm going to drag my initial monkey onto that layer. And I can name this layer monkey, so that all of the monkey's movements are on that layer. And on the lower layer that I added recently, I'm going to call this reference. And I'm going to give the line that I drew with the brush tool a different color, just so I have a clear visual reference. I'm going to go a light greeny blue. Now I'm going to once again sketch my monkey, but I need to maintain the proportions. So I'm going to copy and paste my original monkey, and I'm just going to drag him anywhere in the stage. It doesn't really matter. I'm going to lock the reference layer, and that means I can't change or edit or draw onto that layer. I can only draw on the monkey layer, which is what I want to do. And now I'm going to add a head. Very rough sketch head. Make sure to maintain the same proportions and size as the previous head that I drew, and I'm going to draw a pose of the character sort of being thrown backwards. So I'm going to have his bean-like body like this, some legs sort of flailing out, and arms thrown backwards as well, and his tail. So that we're adding a bit of a motion to his figure's pose. Now I actually want my monkey to be back on my reference layer. I just want to work alone on the monkey layer. So I'm going to unlock my reference layer, paste the monkey and drag him off to the side so that he's there as a reference with my lines, and then lock the reference layer once again. And going back to the monkey layer, I'm going to position the monkey to where he's going to be thrown in. And I'm going to slowly, on every second keyframe, add a duplicate keyframe and just simply move and drag the monkey around. Now I'm not going to worry too much about the motion of the monkey or what it looks like. I'm just trying to get the pacing of the animation all laid out in my animatic. So for example, the duration between when he walks off and then is thrown back is a little too short. So I'm going to extend this and drag out that duration so that there's a little bit of a pause when we don't know what's happening, and then all of a sudden he's thrown off into the screen. Then I'm going to create a new keyframe and draw a very rough sketch of a very squashed monkey. This will all be refined much later, but we just want to get the basic idea across, and that is the monkey has been thrown back into our view, and there's some weight to this throw motion. We're going to go into more detail into how we can accentuate these movements and use principles of animation like squash and stretch to make the motions seem weighted, and also using easing in and easing out in the arcs of motion to make sure that we're communicating weight as well through the movement while he's in the air. Now I'm just going to copy that monkey shape that I drew, even though after bouncing his pose would be different. We're just going for the bare bones in our animatics. We're not going to be too complicated. So I'm just reusing the very rough art that I've drawn and placing it every second keyframe apart. And I'm just going to go back and test that I have the motion playing out in a way that I'm happy with. Bounce, bounce, and then I'm going to create a new keyframe here. Once again, using my reference monkey as a guide for the shape and size of the head. I'm going to sketch in my little circle, and I'm going to drag him down here and make sure, and I'm going to then draw him with his legs forward and his body sort of bouncing down like this. Again, we're going to add some squash and stretch to it. So we have this bounce here on the ground. Now, as you can see, his tail sort of gets thrown down just for the sake of adding some solidity to our animatic. I'm just going to edit that tail there. It doesn't really matter though, once again, because we're going to go through this in refined detail when we do the animation. So once again, I'm going to go back to my little sketch that I drew earlier and reuse this character on 2 frames. And then finally, we have our last frame, and I'm just going to cheat here a bit and delete the body of my sketch and just push the head down on the ground. So you can see in my animatic, I'm already getting the motion being laid out. Now, I'm not going to really use this reference too much longer, but I'll keep him there for the time being. But what I can do to make him less distracting, because it's the same color as these lines that I'm drawing, is I can make it all wireframed, which is again a feature that is in most animation programs that you can use. So once I have the character sketched out laying down on the ground, A few frames later, I'm going to have him sit up, and to do this, I'm going to once again take my head shape, and I'm going to copy this so I can paste it later, and I'm going to flip back and forth to make sure he's going to sit up in position properly. Now his butt is here, so I'm going to make sure to put his butt here as he sits up. His hands might be on the ground, his bean-like body sitting there, and his legs sort of bent as he sits up, and his tail might be poking out the back there as well. So this is his next pose. After he is thrown in, bounce, he sits up. He might sit there for a while and his head might sort of rock a bit and he might have stars around his head. In fact, I'll communicate this with a bit of a line there. And then the next motion I'm going to have is him jumping up. Now we're going to go into detail into how to do this with a lot of energy later in another tutorial, but I'm for now going to draw his next pose, which will be standing. And we need to make sure our feet are going to be in the right position. He's going to be bent forward because he's going to have thrown himself up in the process of standing, and his legs are going to be sort of wide apart to stabilize himself. So I'm going to sketch that in roughly and position it. Once again, flicking back and forth to make sure that we're in the right sort of place. Make tweaks as you go along, but like I keep saying, it's really not that important to be super accurate with your drawings. The animatic is really rough. We're more focusing on the time span between these frames, on the composition and layout of where the action is happening, and making sure that everything feels paced correctly. So we have a bit of a short pause and we can sort of drag things out as we figure out the pacing. So I think things are going to be more extended than I've left time for. So we have the initial walk across the screen, short pause, and then bam, thrown, bounces across, he sits up, his head spins a bit, and then he sort of comes to. And as he comes to, I should probably indicate that by getting rid of these lines around his head. And then he stands up. Now I'm going to add a frame in between the sitting down and the standing. And it's going to be a bit of a lunge backwards. This is going to communicate anticipation, a lead in to the action. If you want to learn more about anticipation, definitely check out the actual animation tutorial when we do this. But there's a summary in the reference files that you can check out about anticipation itself. So I'm going to make sure he's on the right sort of angle. He's going to have his hands back towards the ground because he's going to flip off of the ground. So we're going to make sure his knees are up like this and his whole body is getting ready to do this motion. And then we'll drag out the frames a bit so there's a bit of a pacing between them. So he comes to, back, and throws himself forward. There should still be a bit more space between them. Comes to, back, and throws himself forward. Then the next thing we're going to have is another walk cycle. So I'm actually going to take my reference character here and copy it, but then delete it from my reference frame and relock my reference frame. Now I no longer need this arc that we've used here. I'm going to cut it off where he's finished his bounce. Right there. So only in the duration of his bounce do we have the arc as a reference in that layer. But then much later on, I'm going to paste my copied walk cycle and I'm going to position it immediately after this angry standing pose. And I'm going to duplicate this symbol and call this tween 2. And this is going to be another tweened walk cycle, but this one's going to look a little bit different. We're going to be leaning forward and it's going to be more of a paced walk. So we're going to have his bean-like body like this, and he's going to be marching forward aggressively. Hands in fists, ready to mean business to whoever threw him out on the stage. So once again, checking back to make sure our positioning is right. There we go, so I'm pretty happy with that. He's going to be marching forward, and now we can further extend the timeline out and add a second keyframe later on that this clip will tween between. The pacing of this one is going to be quicker than our initial walk cycle, and already it feels a little bit slow, so I'm just going to keep dragging it in, and it's going to be a duration of under 100 frames. It's also important to note that it's going to be a shorter duration because he begins on the right third of the screen, whereas our initial walk cycle, he begins off the screen, and we have a slower pace. So going back to our second walk cycle, it's about the same pace at the moment. I'm going to shorten it even more, and we get much more of a marching pace. So he's angrily sort of stomping forwards. And again, we need a little bit of a break just so that the viewers have time to build their suspense for what might happen next. And then the final part of our animatic is going to be the punchline, I suppose you could say, where we have the character, the monkey character, running away. Now I'm going to use tween 1, my symbol, as a base. I'm going to duplicate this once again into tween 3. And the reason I'm doing this is because the leaning back pose is much more suited to what I'm going for, but I'm going to get rid of the limbs. I'm going to keep the head and the body. And now I'm just going to add new limbs. I'm going to throw the head and body leaning back a little bit more and have a really extreme distance between the legs in his frantic running, and I'm going to have his hands reaching forward. Now this is quite a fun sort of comical way to animate a run, where we have the head and body arcing back like this, and then the legs very wide apart doing very large motions, and the hands reaching forward. And that's something that can end up looking quite cool and also works well with a faster paced run cycle. So now that I have this, I'm actually going to flip it because he's going to be running in the other direction, but I do need to make sure that the positioning is in the same area as the legs of the previous character. So what I might actually do is on my reference layer that I have set up here just to glance at for referencing things, I'm going to draw a line for where the position of the ground is. I'm actually going to copy this line and put it at the start of the animation and just make sure that he's following that line. As you can see, he's off it slightly, so I'm just going to pull him up on the first few frames and drag him up on the second few frames. You can't really see that because I did it off of the screen, but now you can see that he's adjusted and his feet are anchored to that reference line. Next, he follows that arc of motion, he sits up and jumps up and angrily marches off towards whatever threw him out. And then all of a sudden, we're going to have him sprinting along. Now, of course, his feet aren't touching the ground in this run just as a reference for the animatic. He will when he's actually running, but we need to sort of position it in an area that we think would work well for where his feet will be positioned. And as you can imagine, the duration of this run cycle is going to be a lot shorter. Even though he's still running across the entire span of the screen, we can have him zip across in a much shorter span of frames. Now, this next part is where animatics are most important. The pacing between the breaks of action. So, for example, we have this break of action here of him stomping off, storming away in anger, and then we have this next break of action of him sprinting away. There is a gap between these two action sequences that communicates something. Now, the interesting thing is if that gap is too short, the viewer doesn't have enough time to interpret what's happening. If that gap is too long, the viewer can lose interest in what's actually happening. So we need to develop our sense of timing and pacing to make sure that we're giving the viewer enough time to see what's happening, but still keep them attentive to what we're presenting in our animation. I'm going to play it all from the beginning. We have a paced, slow walk cycle. He's going to be cheerily walking along, and then slight gap, and then he's thrown. And that's going to catch the viewer by surprise, which is a good thing. Then he kicks up and angrily storms off. I feel good about the timing so far, and then running away. Now, what is he running away from? I'm going to add a new layer, and I'm going to call this Gorilla. And what's going to happen is immediately after his run off, in the side of the screen, a very large, very angry gorilla is going to be jumping out from the side with his furious fists and hulking body smashing down on the ground. So this is a very rough sketch of what is going to be in the final animation, but what I essentially want to communicate is what is going to happen. So I'm going to position him with his fists on the ground. I'll try and get the proportions to a place that I'd be roughly happy with for the final piece, but I don't actually know what the gorilla is going to look like yet, so we'll get to that when we get to it. But the idea is that this very large gorilla, especially compared to the size of this little chimp monkey thing, is intimidating and surprising to the viewer. And what we can do to communicate this is a frame in between his run cycle just before he's out of reach of the gorilla, so we can see why the gorilla missed. We can have a keyframe, and then previous to that we can have a very short keyframe just to communicate a motion like this, to indicate that there are fists coming in angrily and quickly and stomp immediately where the monkey previously was. And we get that sense of the fact that this large gorilla had reached out to smash or grab or wrestle the little monkey, and that's why he's running away. And then to end the sequence, we're going to have the gorilla turn and he'll walk off of the screen. And for the sake of simplicity in our animatic, we're going to just communicate this with a simple tween motion called tween 4, and we'll pick a duration of frames of which he will disappear from view. We don't want it to be too fast because this large hulking beast smashes down quickly, but then we want to ease out of the situation we've thrown our viewers into. So we're going to have him fairly calmly step back. And then the cool thing about this sequence is that we can play again from the beginning, and it's a bit of a loopable situation. So again, the monkey carelessly walks into the territory of something that throws him out. He bounces, comes to his senses, angrily gets up and fearlessly marches forward until all of a sudden, he runs away because the giant gorilla is angry. And that's our little sequence that we've created in the animatic, and it's also providing us with a lot of little scenarios we can use to learn animation, beginning with a simple walk cycle using tweens, and then creating some dynamic frame-by-frame animation using pose-to-pose animation techniques and keyframes, and then using principles of animation like squash and stretch to make the motion more interesting, and then we're going to work on some hybrid animation, which is a mix of tweens and frame-by-frame animation. And then finally, we're going to do a frame-by-frame run cycle, finishing off with the gorilla. And that will complete our sequence. We've created an animatic from start to finish. And once again, I encourage you to check out the example in the folder that you can see this reference file in, which is a video compilation of some animatics that I've created for some final professional productions that I've made, which is an example to how, whether it be in personal projects or client projects, this really simplistic style of creating animatics has always been the staple way to begin an animation for myself and for many other animators. It's a really clear, clean, and simple way to create a reference for you to animate then on top of, so you can have a sense of knowing where you're going and having planned everything out in your timing and pacing. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'm going to see you in the next tutorial where we take this character and create a fun side-on tweened walk cycle.